We'll just interrupt you there. Do forgive me. We are about to hear from the French President and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
Signatories for the agreement on security between Ukraine and France, signed by President Zelensky and President Macron. There will be a signing ceremony and then a press conference. This is a ceremony for the signing of the bilateral pact between Ukraine and the French Republic. Volodymyr Zelensky will be signing for Ukraine and for France, Mr. Emmanuel Macron, President of the French Republic. After the ceremony, there will be a press conference.
It's mine. Okay. I took this paper and it's fine. It's okay.
Bien, Monsieur le Président,
Mr. President,
cher Volodymyr, Messieurs les
dear
ministres,
Volodymyr, Mr.
Messieurs les
Ministers,
ambassadeurs, Mesdames et
Madam
Messieurs, en votre grade et
Ministers,
qualité.
Ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen,
Je suis très heureux,
I am very
cher
happy
Volodymyr, de te
dear
recevoir à
Volodymyr,
nouveau aujourd'hui.
to welcome you
à Paris.
here once again in Paris.
C'est la troisième fois depuis
This
le
is the
début du
third
conflit
time since the beginning of the
et de
conflict
l'agression russe
and the
contre ton
beginning
pays.
of Russian aggression against
Cela
your
fait de
country.
nombreuses fois parce que je n'oublie pas
You have come
ta
3
première
times.
visite
I
dans ces
remember
lieux.
very well the first
J'étais
time you
alors
came
candidat dans l'entre-deux-tours
at the time
en Ukraine et c'était la
The
première fois que nous nous voyions. En
presidential
te recevant
election was
aujourd'hui,
going
c'est à
on. You were a
travers
candidate.
toi, à tout le peuple ukrainien,
I would like to
que nous voulons
express to
d'abord
you and
exprimer
all of
notre
the Ukrainian
admiration
people how much
et surtout
admiration we
notre
have for you
détermination
and how
à
determined
continuer de
we are
soutenir l'Ukraine
to
dans la
continue
durée.
to support Ukraine over
Cette
time.
détermination est aussi
This
forte qu'au
determination
premier
is
jour et
as
je
strong
veux
as it
ici
was on the
te
first
dire
day,
que notre
and I
engagement
would
à
like to
vos
tell you that
côtés
our
ne
commitment
faiblira
to
pas.
stand beside you will not
C'est
weaken.
aussi le sens de l'accord bilatéral de
This
sécurité
is the
que nous
meaning behind
venons
this
un instant de
bilateral
signer.
security pact that we have
Il
just
vient
signed.
concrétiser un engagement que
It
nous avions
is the
pris
concretization
avec tous les
of
pays du
our
G7 au sommet de
commitment
l'OTAN à Vilnius en juillet dernier.
that was made
Il
last
inscrit non seulement
July in
notre soutien dans la
Vilnius.
durée, mais aussi dans
At the
une
time of the
démarche et
NATO
une
summit.
logique collective,
It is a
puisque
collective
le
approach
Royaume-Uni et l'Allemagne
because the UK
ont
and
déjà conclu
Germany
un accord
have
comparable
already
et
signed
qu'à terme
comparable
tous les autres
agreements,
pays du G7
and
et 25
ultimately
autres pays
all of the
feront de même.
G7 and 25 other countries will have also signed
Alors que
such
nous allons dans
agreements.
quelques jours entrer dans la troisième
In
année
a
de
few
cette guerre
days,
que
we will be
seule
entering
la
into the
Russie
third year
a
of
voulu.
this war that was
Je
provoked by
n'oublie pas,
Russia
cher
alone.
Volodymyr, nos échanges aux
I
premières
would
heures de
not
cette
forget
funeste journée du
what
24 février
we spoke about, dear
2022,
Volodymyr, on the
et je veux
24th
avoir
of
une pensée
February,
pour tous les Ukrainiens,
3 years ago, and I have
ceux
my
que la
thoughts go
guerre
out to
a
all of the
arrachés à
Ukrainian
leur
people
maison, à leur famille,
who have lost their houses,
pour
their
ceux qui se battent sur le
families,
front,
for all those who
à
are fighting on the
Avdiivka en
front in
particulier et ailleurs.
Adivka in particular
Les
and
Ukrainiens
elsewhere.
aujourd'hui se battent non
Today,
seulement pour leur
Ukrainians are fighting
liberté,
not only for their freedom,
mais pour la sécurité
but also for
européenne,
European
pour la
security,
solidité des démocraties
for the
libérales
solidity of
et
liberal
la défense du
democracy,
droit
and the
international.
defense of international law.
Cher Volodymyr, nous sommes
Dear
déterminés à
Volodymyr,
vos côtés à
we
faire
are
échec à la
determined to
guerre
stand
d'agression de la
beside you
Russie.
to stop
Le courage
the war of
de la
aggression,
résistance ukrainienne, le sursaut d'unité
the
que
great
votre juste
unity
combat a suscité
that
ont
has
déjà
arisen around your
conduit
very
à une série de
justified
défaites
and just
stratégiques
conflict means
de
that
la Russie.
there will be a strategic
Il y a 2
defeat
ans, la
of
Russie
Russia.
nous expliquait
2 years
mener une
ago, Russia
opération
was saying
spéciale
that this was a
qui
special
allait se conclure en
operation
quelques semaines.
that would only take a
Elle
few
en est
weeks.
réduite à vider ses prisons
And
pour
now,
remplacer les pertes
Russia
colossales
is
qu'elle subit
emptying
sur le
its
front.
prisons in order to
On
fill
nous
the
expliquait
ranks
que la
of the
Russie
military soldiers on the
avait un
front.
avenir certain. Beaucoup de jeunes Russes ont préféré la
Many young
liberté à la guerre
Russians
et se retrouvent à Belgrade, Tbilissi,
have
Istanbul,
fled
Paris.
to
La Russie
Belgrade
a
or
perdu ses talents.
Istanbul and Paris. because they do not want to fight in this war. Russia is financing an unjust, unfair, and cruel war rather than serving its own population with the basic services, or rather than, for example, helping people to buy basic foodstuffs.
Les années 90, autour des
In
différents formats
the
internationaux,
90s,
elle a perdu cette place.
we saw that Russia began to lose
Elle l'a
its
perdu parce qu'elle n'est plus
significant
invitée,
role
elle l'a perdu parce que
on
l'Ukraine
the international
rejoindra
stage
l'Union européenne et je l'espère aussi l'OTAN.
because
Elle a perdu stratégiquement,
it
elle, pour qui l'accès aux mers est
strategically failed,
en poussant la Finlande et la Suède à rejoindre
But
l'OTAN
it
et
pushed
ce faisant à faire de la mer
Finland
Baltique une
to
mer
join
aujourd'hui
NATO, and
où les Alliés ont une place
and
prépondérante.
it's seeking to have
Elle a
access
perdu
to the sea.
stratégiquement enfin parce qu'elle met au goulag ses esprits libres,
It carried out
qu'elle les y
actions that
condamne à mort,
included
à
sending
l'instar
people to
de
the
M.
Gulag,
Navalny, dont je
people
salue
such
la
as
mémoire
Alexei
et
Navalny,
l'engagement.
whose
Je pense
memory
ce
and
soir
commitment
à son
I
épouse,
pay
à sa
tribute to
famille.
today. And this evening I'm thinking
Lui
of
qui
his
dément le
wife
déclin
and
du
his
courage
family.
contre lequel nous
He
mettait si justement en garde
showed
Solzhenitsyn.
as
Oui,
much courage as
La mort de
another
M.
great
Navalny
dissident, Alexander
dit la
Solzhenitsyn.
faiblesse du Kremlin et la peur de
Navalny's
tout opposant.
death shows that
Les faits sont têtus,
Russia
mais il
is
faut toujours
weak
les
and they are
rappeler.
afraid of all
Il y a un agresseur,
dissidents in opposition.
l'Ukraine, et
In
un
this war,
agresseur, la Russie.
Ukraine
Et si cette
has
agression
been
vise
suffered
principalement
from the
l'Ukraine, elle
aggression
fait de
of
nombreuses
Russia.
autres victimes.
There are many
L'ordre et le
victims
droit international, la
as
stabilité
well,
du monde,
including world
la planète
stability,
entière par les déséquilibres
international
que
law,
cette
and in fact the
agression a
whole
créés,
planet
en
has
particulier sur
been
le plan
affected,
alimentaire.
in particular with regard
La
to food
Russie,
security.
Malgré ses revers,
Russia
s'est lancée
despite
dans
its
une
losses,
fuite en avant.
keeps pushing forward
ces 2 dernières
senselessly
années.
and has done so
Et
for
elle
2
a, tout
years now.
particulièrement ces derniers
In
mois,
particular, in the recent months,
accumulé et durci
Russia has
toutes les postures agressives,
hardened its aggressive
pas
stance,
simplement face à l'Ukraine.
not only facing
contre nous
Ukraine,
tous.
but against everyone.
Aujourd'hui, c'est une
Today,
nouvelle phase qui s'ouvre.
This is a new phase that we see beginning.
La Russie de Vladimir Poutine est
Vladimir
devenue un
Putin's
acteur
Russia
méthodique de
has
la
become
déstabilisation
a
du monde,
methodical
qui
actor
n'hésite
of
pas à
world
menacer son environnement,
destabilization,
mais aussi
continues to
directement
threaten
nos intérêts.
its environment and our interests.
La Russie est devenue une puissance
Russia has
impérialiste
become an imperialist
qui
power.
nie la souveraineté de l'Ukraine,
It
de
denies
son
the
droit, de sa
sovereignty of
capacité à
Ukraine,
faire
its
ses choix,
right
à choisir
to
ses
make its
alliances,
own
bref, à
choices, to choose
exister.
its own alliances, and indeed to
Et
exist.
au fond, ce que cherche la
And
Russie,
what Russia
c'est un ordre
seeks
fondé sur la force.
is
Ce
order
que
based
défend
on
l'Ukraine et nous
force.
avec elle, et le respect des principes fondamentaux du droit
And
international.
this denies
La Russie est
the
devenue une
respect of
puissance
basic
révisionniste
international law.
de manière croissante ces
Russia
dernières
is
années.
revisionist and has been growing
Les
ever
propos
more
tenus encore
so.
récemment montrent que cet appétit de
Recently,
réécrire
we have
l'histoire n'a
seen
plus de
that
limite.
they seek to rewrite
Il n'y a pas que
history,
les pays qu'elle a récemment envahis, comme l'Ukraine ou la
and
Géorgie,
not
qui ont des
only in
raisons de
countries such as
s'inquiéter.
Ukraine
La
and
Russie
Georgia that it has
bâtit
recently invaded.
actuellement,
Russia,
devrais-je dire plutôt le régime du Kremlin,
or I
car
should
je ne
say
veux pas ici y
the
engager
regime of the Kremlin,
tout un
because
peuple,
I don't
mais
mean to
simplement
speak of all
quelques décideurs
Russians,
qui
but I
ont
would say the
décidé
leaders
précisément
of the
de
country
changer
today have
pour le pire
decided
le destin de leur propre nation. Le régime du Kremlin bâtit
on a
actuellement un
very
récit
special
fantasmé
future for
pour
their
remettre
country,
en
which
cause
is
les frontières héritées de
based
l'Union soviétique en
on
reniant sa
borders
propre parole et
inherited
ses
from the
propres
Soviet
engagements,
Union, turning their
notamment
backs on their
ceux pris à
own
Alma-Ata en
commitments, in
1991,
particular
ce qui est une menace pour
1991
l'Europe, le
agreements made in
Caucase,
Alma-Ata.
l'Asie centrale.
And this
Elle doit
involves
savoir que le monde
the
la regarde,
Caucasus.
que chacun est en
and
droit de se
Central
demander
Asia.
quel nouveau bout tronqué et truqué
So,
d'histoire
I think
elle invoquera pour
in this
poursuivre
part of the
son
world,
agenda.
everyone
Quel
is
nouveau pays
wondering
sera sa proie,
which will be the
quel autre
next
pays
country to
demain
be
sera tenté de
attacked by
l'imiter.
Russia as they continue to
La Russie
seize
a aussi
more
ces
territory.
dernières années accumulé des
In recent years,
interférences
we've seen
dans
that
les élections.
Russia has also
Je n'oublie
interfered
pas
in
que
elections.
moi-même, lors de la campagne électorale de
Myself,
2016-2017,
during the
j'avais subi des attaques très directes de la
2016-2017
Russie.
electoral campaign,
J'avais eu
I
l'occasion de m'en
was
expliquer lors de
subject to
notre première
direct
rencontre avec
attacks from
Vladimir
Russia,
Poutine.
and I discussed that with
Ces
Vladimir
derniers
Putin when I
mois,
met with him.
partout en Europe,
Recently, all around
ces
Europe,
manœuvres
we have
de
seen these
désinformation, de
fake
manipulation
news
de l'information,
and
mais les attaques sur le
news
plan cyber
manipulation and
se sont
cyber attacks
profondément multipliées,
that have
systématisées
proliferated
et
systematically
intensifiées.
and have become more
La
intensified.
Russie, en effet,
Russia,
a
indeed,
franchi plusieurs seuils
has crossed a line, has crossed several
à
lines
l'égard
in
des
this regard.
démocraties européennes
When we look at
durant les
European
dernières semaines et les
democracy,
derniers
and
mois.
this over the
C'est
past
ce qui nous a
weeks and
conduits,
months,
avec
which has
l'Allemagne et la
led us,
Pologne,
with Germany and
à
Poland,
révéler et attribuer
to
plusieurs de ces attaques. Nous
reveal the
continuerons de
source
faire
of
de
certain
même.
of these attacks, and we will
Ce
continue to
changement de
reveal
posture
these
marque très
attacks.
clairement
This change in
une volonté
attitude
d'agression
shows a
à
clear
notre
will
endroit.
to
Enfin, la
aggress
Russie a
us directly.
multiplié
Russia
aussi
has
les
also
zones de confrontation et de
multiplied the zones of
déstabilisation
confrontation and
en Afrique comme au
destabilization in
Proche et
Africa
Moyen-Orient.
as well as in the Middle
Il
and
n'est
Far and
pas
Near
jusqu'à
East.
l'espace où ne se posent de graves questions. Je reste ici prudent,
Serious questions
mais les
arise,
inquiétudes exprimées par
and I am
certains
cautious,
ces
but
derniers
some
jours
have
sur le
expressed
possible déploiement par la
concerns
Russie
about a
d'armes
possible
nucléaires dans
deployment of
l'espace
nuclear
compléter
weapons in
ce tableau.
space by Russia.
Ces faits, s'ils étaient confirmés,
If this were to
seraient
be
si graves,
confirmed,
si illégaux,
this would
si
be
déstabilisants pour le
so
monde et
serious,
préoccupants
so
pour les
terrible for
citoyens
the world and
que la
its
Russie
citizens
doit sans tarder
that
donner des explications.
we must immediately ask for some explanations from Russia
doivent très
about
clairement
this
s'en
rumor.
saisir. Tout ceci montre
International
clairement que
bodies
ces
must
dernières années,
take this into account.
la
So this
Russie,
shows
sur plusieurs
clearly
de
that
ces
for the
points,
past several years,
avait
Russia
une forme de continuité, impérialisme,
has continued with its
révision de
imperialist
l'histoire,
actions, its
déstabilisation
revisionism,
de nos
its
démocraties,
destabilizing actions for democracy,
l'intensification
and
de
the
ces agressions, le
intensification
changement de
of all
nature
of
et les
these
seuils
aggressive
franchis
acts and the
font
lines that have been
qu'il est temps
crossed
aujourd'hui de le dire,
mean that it is
ce
time to say
changement de
today
posture de la
that this
Russie
change in
exige
Russia's
un
attitude
sursaut collectif.
demands a collective
Un
response.
message clair venu
This
d'Europe,
is a clear message from
celui
Europe.
que nous ne laisserons pas faire,
We
mais
will
aussi
not
très
let
clairement
Russia get away with it, but
un signal de la
clearly
communauté
it is a signal
internationale, car
by
ces
the
agressions touchent la
international community
stabilité
because
tout entière de la
this
planète
aggression
et concernent
has an
tous les
impact
pays qui ont des
on the
responsabilités
whole
diplomatiques
world
éminentes.
and on
Que les
diplomatic
choses soient claires, la
events
France n'est pas
around the
en
world.
guerre, ni contre la Russie,
France
ni
is
contre
not
le
at
peuple
war,
russe.
not at war with
La
Russia
France a d'ailleurs
or
tout
the
fait
Russian
pour empêcher
people.
la guerre en
France
Ukraine.
did everything we
Mais
could
nous
to
sommes
stop the
décidés
war
à
in
faire
Ukraine,
échec
but
à
we
la guerre d'agression
are
de la
have
Russie
decided
contre
that we will
l'Ukraine
stop
et à
this
toutes les
war of
agressions dont
aggression
la
against
Russie pourrait se
Ukraine
rendre
and
coupable.
any other aggressive
Si la Russie pense qu'elle peut
actions that
affaiblir notre
Russia would engage in.
détermination,
This is part of our
miser sur telle ou telle
determination.
élection, ou bien sur notre lassitude, alors
So
elle se
Russia cannot count on us
Devant toi, cher
falling
Volodymyr,
back
je veux ici
or
redire
letting
que la
things
France
slide because we will
continuera
not.
de soutenir l'Ukraine dans
France
la
will
durée.
continue to support
C'est le sens,
Ukraine as
je
long
le
as
disais dès le
necessary.
début de mon propos,
And
de
this
l'accord que
is
nous avons conclu
why we have
pour
signed
une
this
durée de
agreement
10
today
ans
for a
et qui
10-year
restera valide tant
period,
que l'Ukraine
and it
n'aura
will
pas
remain
rejoint
valid
l'OTAN.
as long as
Dans le cadre
Ukraine
de
has
cet
not
accord, la
joined
France
NATO.
s'est
Within the
engagée
framework
à
of this
apporter
agreement,
jusqu'à 3 milliards d'euros
France will
d'aide militaire supplémentaire
an extra
l'Ukraine
3 billion
en
euros
2024,
of aid, of
après
military
les
aid to Ukraine in
1,7 milliards d'euros
2024,
de 2022 et les 2,1
after the
milliards d'euros de
1.7 and the
2023.
2.1 billion that we
Cette aide a pour
previously
objectif de
provided.
continuer de fournir à
So
l'Ukraine
this
les moyens
assistance
de
is to
défendre dans la durée
continue
sa souveraineté.
to enable Ukraine to defend
intégrité
its
territoriale.
sovereignty and its territorial integrity.
La France s'engage aussi à
France
poursuivre
is also
le
committed
soutien qu'elle apporte à l'Ukraine sur tous les plans.
to supporting Ukraine in all
Fourniture de matériel
areas,
militaire,
military equipment,
coopération entre industries de défense, avec le
industrial
développement de
defense
coproduction,
industrial cooperation,
formation,
training,
renseignement, aide civile, etc. En aidant nos partenaires
intelligence,
ukrainiens à se
civil
défendre,
aid,
nous
and so
investissons
forth.
pour la sécurité de l'Europe,
We will continue to
le
invest for the
renforcement
security of
de la
Europe.
base industrielle,
We will
technologique et de
reinforce the
défense
industrial,
européenne.
technological, and defense basis
cela
of Europe.
Représente déjà beaucoup,
This is a
mais nous
lot,
sommes déterminés à faire
but
encore
we are
davantage,
determined to do
y compris
even
en
more,
bousculant les habitudes, le confort de certaines certitudes.
and even
Je souhaite en
if
particulier
it sometimes
que la France et l'Union
is
européenne
a
continuent de s'adapter au
disruptive
contexte nouveau qui est le nôtre.
approach.
Cela
In
supposera
this
un effort
new
résolu de
context
réarmement,
today, we have to
termes de
look at
doctrine et de
rearmament, we
moyens.
have to look at doctrine, we have to
Il
look at
s'agit là
our
d'un nouveau
means.
test pour l'Union
This is a
européenne.
new test for the
Mais
European
l'issue de la
Union,
guerre d'agression de la Russie
but the
contre
end
l'Ukraine
of the
sera décisive
war of aggression
pour nos intérêts, nos valeurs,
will be
notre sécurité
decisive
et notre
for our
modèle.
interests, our security, and our
Dès le
model of
sommet de
society.
Versailles en mars 2022, convoqué sous
In
présidence française de
2022,
l'Union
under the
européenne,
Versailles Summit,
nous avons montré notre capacité
we showed that we
ensemble
were capable
à
to work
changer de
together
paradigme.
to change our
Aider l'Ukraine à
paradigm
défendre sa souveraineté va
and
de
to
pair
help
avec notre
Ukraine
propre souveraineté et notre
to
autonomie
define
stratégique.
its
Et
sovereignty.
notre endurance, notre détermination
Our
seront
endurance,
encore
our
éprouvées,
determination
mais nous trouverons
will certainly be
l'énergie
tested, but we
et les
will
ressources
find the energy and the
pour continuer de nous
resources
transformer.
to continue
C'est aussi la raison pour laquelle
to move
je
forward.
veux ici
And
redire
this
mon
is why I
soutien
would
à la
like to say
proposition
here once again
de
that
la
I
Première ministre
support
estonienne Kaja
the
Kallas
Estonian Prime Minister's proposal that we should provide the necessary financing over time to support Ukraine and mobilize our industrial base throughout Europe. Yes, Europe must invest more over time and must scale up. This is what I wish to say, Mr. President, dear Volodymyr. We are determined to stay with you until the end. We are convinced that in so doing, we are defending not only Ukraine, but we are defending what we all share on this continent, our shared values. France will stand beside you tomorrow as we do today, and I'd like to thank you once again for coming to Paris today, with all of our support for today, for tomorrow, and as long as necessary. Thank you very much.
Дуже дякую. Хочу подякувати тобі, Еммануеле.
I would like to thank you, Emmanuel. We have met several times now, and I'm sure you understand me quite well, even if I speak Ukrainian. We have had several very important meetings, 3 very important meetings that have taken place as we face this challenge. The Russian occupation, their attack on our territory, on our values. And all of our meetings have been very powerful. But today's meeting, I think, is special. The spirit of this meeting is powerful when compared to the previous meetings. And I'd like to thank you for the depth of your understanding of what is happening in Ukraine, for understanding the horrible, bloody tragedy that we are suffering. And I'd like to thank you for your work, the work of your team, as you have worked together for a united Europe as well. And I would like to thank you once again for inviting me here today and for our negotiations. Dear journalists, ladies and gentlemen of the press,
домовленості, вони завжди надихають. Україна і Франція вміють разом додавати
what we have been negotiating today is very inspirational to me. Ukraine and France can join forces for the defense of the people of Europe, for our Europe. We have signed
безпекова угода, і не про всі її деталі ми можемо
a very ambitious security pact.
Але це те, що дійсно стверджує у цій війні.
Not all of the details will be made public today, but in this war that Putin launched against Ukraine and its people, against the Ukrainian people, living people, and against the world, the whole world, in fact, this war is not the future. We aspire to defend our country for peace, peace that everyone in Europe wants. Our cooperation will increase. 3 billion euros this year. This is a very impressive amount. Thank you very much personally. Secondly, France has had a very specific support for Ukraine with regard to Ukraine joining NATO. And I'd like to thank you, Emmanuel, for your support as we move towards joining the European Union, also for your support in the decision to launch negotiations. It is thanks to your leadership that we've been able to undertake these negotiations. Thirdly, I'd like to thank you for sanctions against Russia and its leaders. These are absolute priorities for us. In addition, we are looking more closely at cybersecurity, at counterintelligence and intelligence, looking at questions of war crimes. Every piece of information that we can get helps us to defend our country, to defend human lives. Of course, there are battlefields in Ukraine, and our soldiers have needs. We have basic needs for our people as well.
пану
We
президенту
regularly
за всю ту надзвичайно влучну
share
та
information
сильну
with France,
військову допомогу, яку
and
ми отримуємо.
I'm very grateful to France and the French president for all the support you have shown to
саме
us.
такий, який і потрібен. Снаряди
Today,
для артилерії, гармати,
We have signed a very important agreement concerning cannons, artillery,
додаткове
the
посилення
Caesar
ППО.
cannons,
Це абсолютно
very
гідна
efficient
відповідь на
military
спроби
equipment,
Путіна збільшити тиск
and
на наші
a
позиції.
reinforcement
Скориставшись
of our
проблемами
anti-aircraft
постачання від
systems.
деяких партнерів,
Putin is
Франція
trying to weaken us, to break us
дійсно нам
down,
допомагає. Я дякую тобі.
but France
Цінуємо
stands
також, як
beside
вже
us
розпочато
to help
співпрацю
us.
щодо
I
оборонного
thank you once again. I
виробництва,
appreciate our
включно з локалізацією
cooperation
та спільним виробництвом зброї та передачею
with regard
Францією
to
українській виробничій
production,
стороні деяких
industrial production,
інноваційних технологій.
for the
Зокрема,
defense of our
сьогодні
country,
детально обговорили
for
спільне
innovative
виробництво
technology transfer.
дронів та РЕБ. Це надзвичайно вагомо, і
We
кожне з
talked about
таких
production
наших
today, the production of
досягнень працюватиме
drones.
заради
This is
спільного
all very
блага
important to us.
народів наших країн. Ще одне, про що обов'язково варто сказати,
All of
чому?
this
Тому що
contributes
це
to the well-being
абсолютно
of our
принципова
respective
річ. Ми
peoples.
зустрічаємось у день, коли
It
стало
is very
відомо
important to
про
us.
ще одне скоєне Путіним політичне вбивство. Путін взагалі став вже одним із
remember
найбільш кривавих
the day when we
диктаторів у
learned
європейській
of the
історії,
crime
але, на
committed
жаль,
by
його
Putin.
шлях ще не закінчений.
Putin became one of the
Ми
the
будемо
bloodiest
працювати з усіма у світі, хто
dictators in the
має
history of
змогу
humankind, and he
притягти його до
continues
справедливої
down that
відповідальності.
path.
Я закликаю
We will
кожного
work with
лідера світу
all
зараз
institutions
не мовчати і не
that can
залишатися
make him
осторонь.
accountable for
І
his
тих, хто у
crimes,
владі,
and
і
I
тих,
call
хто
on
в опозиції,
all world
вбивця,
leaders
має бути покараний.
to do as
Ми
much as
маємо працювати
possible
разом усі в світі, хто
to punish
цінує
the
саме
aggressor.
життя,
We must
щоб
all
досягти
work
цих
together
абсолютно конкретних і
to
справедливих
defend our shared
результатів.
values
Дякую.
so that we can
Мене,
achieve
я дуже дякую за
honest,
запрошення.
just
Я хочу
results.
подякувати
Thank you
вам,
very much,
Франції,
Emmanuel,
за
for
вашу
your
підтримку.
invitation. I would also like to thank the French people for your support.
Багато чого зробили для наших людей.
You have done so much for the Ukrainian people, for our refugees. Thank you very much for your support. Glory to Ukraine.
Nous allons maintenant répondre aux questions.
Now we will take questions.
Бонсуар, добрий вечір.
Good evening.
Я маю питання до обох президентів.
I have a question.
Сьогодні
for the two
у нас
presidents.
плідний день для України. Трохи раніше була підписана подібна
Today
угода
has
з
been a very
Німеччиною.
important day for Ukraine.
Тож мене цікавить,
Today
що
we signed the
відрізняє
agreement
цю
with
угоду від
Germany
подібної угоди з
and
Німеччиною
now with France.
і
And
ще
I wondered
раніше
if you
з
could
Великою
tell
Британією.
me
Що
what
такого
are some of the differences
особливого
between
запропонувала
the different
Франція
agreements signed with
Україні,
Germany and
чого
with
немає
UK?
в угодах з іншими
What
партнерами,
has France brought
окрім,
that's
звичайно,
particular,
Заходу?
and what is something that adds to the previous agreements? Not counting these Caesar
Нас
cannons, of
поки що
course.
не так багато таких угод. А
We do not have many
кожного з
such
них
agreements
дійсно
as of now, and
по-своєму
each agreement,
посилює Україну.
in its own way,
Посилює
strengthens
воїнів,
Ukraine,
посилює наше
helps our
цивільне
soldiers,
населення. Я думаю, щоб
helps the
порівняти ці
civilian
угоди,
population.
дуже складно у кожній з цих трьох країн.
It would be difficult to
реальних
compare
лідерів
these
безпеки
agreements.
у світі і лідерів захисту
These three
для
countries are the
України.
leaders
В кожній є свої пріоритети, є
in
деталі. Я думаю,
defense
що ви
with regard to
можете
supporting
ознайомитися з ними, тому що
Ukraine.
це
Each
відкриті
agreement has its own
абсолютно
details,
документи. Для нас це
and
важливо, щоб
you will
люди
be able to
бачили,
see the
народи
details of
наших
these
країн це
agreements. It's
бачили.
very
І
important
дуже
for us
важливо,
that
щоб це
there is
бачила
transparency, that Ukrainians
агресивна ворожа
can
Росія,
see
щоб вона
what these
бачила,
agreements
що
are made
Україна
of.
не
And
наодинці,
also that
що дійсно
Russia, our
країни,
enemy, should see that
потужні
Ukraine
країни
is not
світу,
alone.
з потужною
That
економікою,
powerful countries around the
із
world,
реальними
with their
життєвими
powerful economies,
цінностями, що вони
with their
не
values,
залишають Україну, яка
These countries are
економічно
not
ще не така
abandoning
потужна,
Ukraine.
як ці поважні держави,
that Russia
але
is
яка
not that
дуже
powerful
сильно бореться
economically.
за нашу свободу і за цінності цих країн. Ви можете
and that
порівняти,
Ukrainians are
побачити
fighting for our
пріоритети,
freedom
там
and
є
fighting for the
багато
values
що
that we share with the
говорити
countries with whom we have signed these agreements.
багато
You
чому
can look at them and you
дійсно
can see
бути вдячним.
what the details are.
D'un mot, juste
That we have
pour
many
répondre
things
à
to be
Président,
thankful for in
d'abord,
these agreements.
Ces accords successifs et ceux qui viendront,
These
comme je le
different
disais tout à l'heure,
agreements and those that will come after,
complètent.
as I said earlier,
et c'est dans cette complementarité qu'il y a
are
l'utilité
complementary, and that's why they're
pour
useful.
l'Ukraine.
for
Ensuite, ces
Ukraine.
accords, nous les avons voulus au sommet de Vilnius.
These agreements are something that we discussed already at the Vilnius
un chemin
summit.
vers l'OTAN,
We've seen that there is a
mais on ne
path
peut pas, en quelque
towards
sorte,
NATO
laisser un
membership,
vide.
but meanwhile,
Et donc,
we
ces
can't
accords ont
have
pour
a
vocation
vacuum.
de donner une
So these
visibilité sur
agreements
l'engagement militaire,
give us a
avec des chiffres,
visibility
mais
with
derrière
regard
aussi
to military
le détail
engagement
de
with
capacité,
figures, but also
vous l'avez
details
dit,
on
que ce soit des
capacities,
canons, des obus,
whether
des
it's
missiles, de la
cannons,
formation, des formations,
anti-aircraft
d'autres actions dans tout
missiles,
le spectre
trainings,
qui sont utiles
all types
aux
of
besoins
equipment
qui ont
and
été
training.
exprimés
These
par
correspond to the needs that
l'Ukraine et
Ukraine
ses
has
armées.
expressed.
Et enfin, c'est surtout que nous avons appris de
And of
l'histoire.
course, we have learned from
L'Ukraine,
history.
par le passé, avait eu des accords.
In the past, Ukraine
étaient trop
had
vagues.
agreements, but they were
Ils
too
étaient en quelque
vague,
sorte insuffisamment
They were
engageants pour les États.
not
Là, nous nous
sufficiently
engageons sur des
engaging
accords
for
qui
the
sont
states.
concrets.
Now we have very
ça que
concrete
je veux que vous
agreements.
reteniez.
And this is what you
C'est-à-dire, c'est pas un
should
accord de
retain
principe
from
comme ce qui
today's
a
meeting.
existé par le
It is
passé,
not just an agreement
qui,
on
on l'a bien
principle,
vu,
which we've had in the
en
past.
2014
We
d'abord,
saw that
et en
in
2022 n'avait pas donné d'effet.
2014 and 2022, we saw these agreements that did not achieve results. Now we have specific means. We have figures. We have real guarantees for the Ukrainian army so that they can guarantee their defense and they can recover their territories. Good evening from France Presse. With regard to the death of the dissident Alexei Navalny, what kind of a message do you see for Europe and for the Western countries? Is this a sign that Vladimir Putin thinks he is all-powerful? Do you believe he's responsible for Navalny's death? And for Mr. Macron, I'd like to say many European leaders are worried about Russian aggression beyond the borders of Ukraine. What is your analysis of that situation? Do you think that there could be a war with Russia? Is it possible?
La mort soudaine d'Alexei
The sudden
Navalny,
death of Alexei
que
Navalny,
nous avons appris aujourd'hui, nous a tous
which we
bouleversés.
learned of today, was something that was terrible for all of us.
Et elle rappelle de la plus tragique des
And
manières
it reminds us most tragically
du régime du Kremlin
of
et son
the
durcissement.
reality of the Kremlin's regime and how much harder it has become. He throws people in jail. There's nothing new about that.
Il avait encore durci
In recent months, he became
posture à
even
l'égard d'opposants,
tougher
mais aussi
with regard to opponents,
d'associations, d'ONG,
but
de
also
fondations.
NGOs, associations, foundations. I'm thinking about Memorial, for example. These different foundations that even in troubled times were still able to operate, and today they are in very dire straits. And so once again, I would like to express all my condolences to Alexei Navalny's family and his loved ones. As I said earlier, yes, Russia is in a new phase, and we must be clear-eyed. This is a phase of aggression towards European countries through actions of cyber attacks and fake news, and it has scaled up considerably. And in his own country, at a few weeks from the election, he has become he appears to see himself as being beyond the law. This, to me, reveals a lot about where Russia is today, and the tragic death of Navalny must be explained. I think there are many political prisoners in Russia, and I think that a lot of these prisoners risk death. I'm thinking of Vladimir Karamurza, whose health is already poor following 2 attempts at poisoning in 2015 and 2017. His health has been failing since he was imprisoned in 2023 because he's not receiving medical help. And there are so many other opponents and dissidents who are in jail because of their courage. I'm also thinking about Memorial, the NGO, Mr. Oleg Olaf, who has been sentenced to 3 years in jail because he denounced war crimes committed by Russia. Clearly, the presidential campaign, in particular the very small number of people who are allowed to run as candidates, this is something that's gotten worse over the years, and things must change. In this context, some European leaders have said that it would be possible that Russia would attack
ou à nourrir des scénarios. Ça
I
n'a
do
jamais
not
été mon
want
approche.
to fuel the
Et je vais être clair avec
flames
vous.
of fear,
Le
but I
régime
will
du
be clear with
du
you.
Kremlin
The Kremlin
a
regime
agressé il y a 2 ans l'Ukraine, pays
Agr-
européen.
aggressed a European
Le
country,
régime du
Ukraine,
Kremlin
2 years ago.
A
The Kremlin
intensifié
regime has
et durci
intensified
ses agressions
and hardened
contre notre pays
its aggressive
sur le
actions
plan de la
against
désinformation
our
et sur
country
le
with
plan
regard
cyber.
to
Et ce sont des formes de
disinformation and cyber attacks. And this is a kind of
Et
aggression.
donc très clairement, il y a besoin d'un sursaut
So clearly,
européen, mais plus largement
Europe
de nos alliés, de nos partenaires et
and
de la
more
communauté
largely,
internationale,
the international community and all of our allies must join
si on voit les
together to
choses
fight back.
advenir, si on voit une nouvelle phase s'ouvrir,
We
nous
see
devons avoir
this
la
new
lucidité
phase opening up, and we must
d'ouvrir une phase de réflexion
look at it clearly
stratégique et
and
opérationnelle
have a
nouvelle.
strategic and operational approach that is new.
C'est ce que souhaite la France.
This is what France hopes for.
Дякую за запитання.
Thank you for that question.
Сьогоднішні події говорять про те, що Путін вбивця.
Today's events
Якась риторика. І
prove that Putin is an assassin.
Абсолютно.
It's not a question of
зрозуміло, що
rhetoric
він вбивця.
or some kind of signal. It's just a fact. He killed
Це
Navalny. He is an assassin. There's no secret about it.
Сигнал абсолютно зрозумілий, який можна передати лідерам,
It
що
is
ми бачимо з вами,
easy
що
for us to
вбивця йде
understand.
на вибори,
Any world leader can understand that
а люди,
this assassin
які
is
будуть за
heading
нього
towards
голосувати,
re-election,
повинні чітко розуміти, що вони
and people
голосують за вбивцю.
of Russia who will vote for
Будуть
him
обирати собі
must
президента.
understand that they're voting for an assassin
А люди, які мають
and
сьогодні
that their
економічні
president
стосунки
will
з
be
цією
a
людиною,
murderer.
повинні знати, що вони
People who
заробляють,
have
незважаючи на рівень
economic
лідерства,
relations with
вони
this person
заробляють
must
конкретно
understand that
криваві гроші.
whatever
Тому що
their
вони
level
мають
of leadership,
забрати
however much
вбивцю.
money they have, this is blood money that they're
А
dealing
люди,
with
які будуть після
because they have
виборів,
signed contracts
ті
with an
лідери,
assassin.
які будуть
And
вітати
people who,
з обранням
after the elections, leaders who,
президента,
after the
повинні знати,
elections,
що вони
will send their congratulations
легітимізували вбивцю.
to the president must understand
Ось такий сигнал.
that they are giving legitimacy to an assassin.
Хоча
That's
мені
all.
здається, що це не сигнал,
It's very
це
simple to
констатація
understand.
реальності.
It's not some kind of a signal, it's just a reality.
Марафон Єдині новини. У мене питання до пана президента
Nina
Макрона. Раніше
Kolomitz.
ви анонсували
I have a question
свій
for Mr.
візит,
Macron.
до України у лютому. Тож коли вас чекати
You
гості
said that you would come to Ukraine in February, and I'd like to know when we can
La
expect your
mi-mars,
visit.
dans votre pays, aux côtés du président
Yes, I
du peuple ukrainien.
do want to come to your
Vous pouvez
country,
m'attendre dans les prochaines semaines.
and so you can expect me in the next few weeks, certainly.
Bonsoir, Philippe Ricard pour le journal Le Monde.
Le Monde
On voit
newspaper.
donc ces accords de bilatéraux de sécurité
We have seen
signés
in
en
this
Allemagne,
bilateral
en
security
France, bien
agreement
sûr,
signed in
par le
Germany,
Royaume-Uni
in
ces quelques
France,
semaines,
in the UK
se
a few weeks ago.
multiplient,
We see
de
more and more of
nouvelles
these
livraisons d'armes.
agreements then
Je voulais
with
juste
the
savoir, M. Zelensky, et
delivery of
c'est aussi pour
arms.
M. Macron,
I would
est-ce
like
que,
to know,
les
Mr.
Européens
Zelensky and also Mr. Macron,
ne vont-ils pas devoir faire plus encore dans
do
les
you think
prochains
that the
mois,
Europeans should do
notamment si
even
le
more in the
blocage
coming months?
persiste
In
au Congrès
particular,
américain sur les aides
if
militaires
we
américaines?
see
Est-ce
that
que vous attendez
American
encore
aid
davantage
continues to be
de la France, de
blocked,
l'Allemagne?
do you think that
Est-ce que
France and
la
Germany
France
will
et
have to
l'Allemagne, la
step
France
up
notamment, seraient prêts à
if
le
the
faire?
US does back
Et
down?
aussi dans
And
l'hypothèse
is
d'une
France,
victoire
is
de
Europe
M.
ready
Trump
to
aux
do that?
élections présidentielles
And what
américaines
about if Mr.
d'ici à la
Trump
fin de l'année?
is
Et
elected
peut-être, question
by the end of
connexe,
the year?
quand comptez-vous, M. Zelensky, signer
And
un
Mr.
accord de
Zelensky,
sécurité bilatérale avec
do
les
you
États-Unis
think you will be signing any
dans ce
bilateral
contexte?
agreements
Est-ce que
with
ça
the
serait bien
United
pour vous
States?
avant le sommet de Washington
That
de
would be a
l'OTAN
good thing
ou avant
before
les
the
élections?
Washington NATO
Pouvez-vous nous
summit or
expliquer?
before the
Merci,
elections?
merci.
That would be a good thing for you. Could you perhaps tell us a bit about that?
Pour ce qui nous concerne,
With
nous
regard
affichons à travers
to France,
ces différents accords
these different
et nous donnons de la
agreements
visibilité sur notre aide,
give greater
bilatérale,
visibility to our bilateral
militaire,
aid, our
en plus,
military
évidemment, de
aid,
tout ce qui est fait sur le plan civil,
in addition, of
humanitaire,
course, to
et économique.
humanitarian and economic
Et en plus de
assistance.
tout ce qui a été fait. C'est une manière de donner de la
This is a way
visibilité
of creating
indépendamment de
greater
tout.
visibility
Ces accords bilatéraux
independently
sont
of all the
publiés au
rest.
niveau
These
européen par l'accord
agreements
que nous avons conclu au dernier sommet, les 50 milliards d'euros
are complementary to the 50
de dons
billion
et prêts que nous
euros
avons sécurisés au niveau européen.
that we agreed upon
Qui viennent
in
là
the
aussi donner
Vilnius
une
conference.
visibilité et un
So
soutien.
we're giving visibility and
Et
support.
je l'ai dit, nous mettons et nous devons nous
And
mettre en
once
capacité
again, we must
d'adapter cet effort aux besoins en termes d'intensité
adapt
et de délai.
with regard
Aujourd'hui,
to
Nous ne pouvons
the
que nous
intensity of the
féliciter de la
needs.
posture américaine et j'espère que le Congrès
Now, the
débloquera
American
des
attitude, and I
sommes
do
supplémentaires,
hope
mais
the
que la
Congress
posture
will
américaine
free
depuis
up the
le début de la
money,
guerre
but
est aux côtés
the
de l'Ukraine et
American
aux côtés de
position
ses alliés européens.
since the beginning of the
Mais
war
cette
has been
guerre
to
se
stand
passe sur le sol de
beside
l'Europe.
Ukraine
Et
and
donc,
beside
les
its
Européens
European
doivent aussi être
allies.
en
But
capacité
this
de
is
porter les
a war
efforts
taking place in Europe, so
pour que
it's
l'objectif
true
qui est
that
le nôtre, c'est-à-dire que la
European
Russie,
countries
en aucun cas ne
bear a
puisse
lot
gagner,
of
soit atteindre.
responsibility for ensuring that
Et
Russia
donc, nous nous
cannot
adapterons
be
à tous les
victorious in
scénarios.
this war. So we will
Parce que
adapt
l'avenir
ourselves
de
to
l'Europe
any scenario because the future of Europe
ne peut pas être contingent
cannot
à l'élection
be
américaine.
contingent
Je
upon
me
an
fie de la
American
souveraineté
election.
et de l'autonomie stratégique. Ce ne sont pas des mots,
It's a question of
ce sont
sovereignty
des actes.
and
Ce sont
strategy.
des actes que nous prenons.
These are not just words in the wind.
Дуже дякую. Я можу додати
Thank you.
те, що дійсно ці
I would
три
add
угоди, перші три угоди дають
that indeed
впевненості
these three
мені,
first
як
agreements
президенту, що ми не наодинці,
have strengthened our
впевненості нашому
confidence.
суспільству, що
They show that we are not alone.
наші спільні цінності.
It makes
Я дуже
our
радий, що Франція,
society
Великобританія
safer. We
разом і
show
дуже
that we
конкретно
share the same values. France, Ukraine, Germany, UK, we have very specific goals. It's very important in wartime
втрачаєте дуже конкретних людей, які
When
для нас найважливіше. І дуже важливо, що
you have specific needs. It's important for us to know that we will have
але
negotiated assistance that meets our needs with all of our partners. But
ми всі
this is not
разом, і цей союз Сполучених Штатів,
something that's alternative to a U.S.
Німеччини,
assistance. There needs to be an alliance between
нам дуже потрібен.
the UK, France, Germany, Ukraine, and the U.S. It's necessary
Дійсно, абсолютно
for us in order to
неспровокованою
win this war
війною.
against Russia. It's
І я
necessary that
вірю, що ці угоди дадуть поштовх
we have a broad alliance. We think that all of these agreements will help us move forward and will push the United States as well into giving greater priority to Ukraine rather than to some electoral process. And I'm sure that the president stands beside us. The White House has shown its support for us. Of course, they have domestic policy questions, but I hope that they will find the correct answers.
Je crois que cette question concluait notre conférence de
I
presse.
think that
Merci beaucoup,
concludes
mesdames et
our
messieurs.
press conference. I'd like to thank you all very much, ladies and gentlemen.
And you've just been hearing from the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, speaking there in a press conference with the French President Emmanuel Macron after the two signed a new bilateral deal, a military deal for military assistance with worth at approximately 3 billion euros. A long speech from the pair of them, Emmanuel Macron speaking of freedom, democracy, unity, and Volodymyr Zelensky thanking France for its support, both militarily and also its backing for it to join the NATO military alliance. As Volodymyr Zelensky said himself, not all the details are available today, but we can now cross to France 24's Antonio Kerrigan, who is at the Élysée Palace where the two presidents have been speaking. Antonia, what are the main points that we do know?
Well, I mean, the first thing we heard in this joint press conference was an absolutely no-holds-barred character assassination by President Macron of President Putin, a really cutting, searing critique in which he said that Russia has shown itself weak, that President Putin's regime has shown itself weak by what he presumes is the assassination of opposition leader Alexei Navalny, that Russia's doubling down, that it's a new phase in Russia, and that Russia is also an imperialist power. He was extremely cutting on Russia, and then he turned, as you mentioned, to France's commitment. The main takeaway is this 3 billion euros of new money. That outdoes the 2.5, or approximately outdoes by very little, the 2.5 billion pound pledge made by Rishi Sunak's agreement in January, so that's significant. And this is a little bit of a turning point for France, who have been criticised at certain points by some allies for giving arguably less than other allies, although, of course, France disputes those figures. They say that not all of the assistance they have given has been completely public. And that it's also the utility, not just the cash value of what's put on the table, that matters. And Zelensky was extremely was filled with thanks for the French president and also for the French people. When called upon to compare the different agreements, he was, of course, unwilling to participate in any such game, given all the complex diplomacy at stake. This is the third such agreement he has signed. These bilateral defence pacts are born out of the Vilnius summit last summer, in which Ukraine was told it wouldn't be made a member of NATO as long as it's still at war with Russia, which is a huge disappointment for Volodymyr Zelensky's Ukraine, but that instead there would be a number of countries, the G7 members most notably, and 20-odd other countries who also signed up to this declaration, said that they would sign bilateral pacts that would enshrine over 10 years their support, both military and economic, for Ukraine in a really binding pact. And that's what we saw today. We've seen one in London last month, one in Berlin this morning, and Paris today is the latest.
Okay, Antonio, for the moment, thank you very much. Antonio Kerrigan at the Elysee Palace there with the latest after that press conference between Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky and Emmanuel Macron of France. And we're now joined by our international affairs commentator, Douglas Herbert, for more on this. Hi again, Doug. What are your main takeaways from what we've heard from this deal?
Both men look tired. Volodymyr Zelensky looks beleaguered. This is taking place in a completely radically changed context, right? Right now, the stalemate has turned into basically being bogged down on the battlefield in Ukraine. Zelensky's coming into, he was once sacrosanct, criticism of him, but he's coming under more pressure within his own ranks and among the public who are just weary of the war, wondering if he has a strategy, a real plan ahead. They don't doubt his sincerity, his loyalty, his determination, his resilience, but what they are dying to see, literally, is some sort of vision for what comes next. Macron, standing there as a member of the European Union and of NATO. He is a president who has had to have this meeting with Zelensky out of necessity. Why? Because the NATO summit in Vilnius last July 2023, failed to produce a clear pathway for Ukraine to become a NATO member. That is a member of the 31-member Western Alliance. In the absence of that, Europe, Ukraine's allies, are left scrambling to show in concrete terms that they are still extremely ironclad committed to helping Ukraine, to staying with Ukraine as long as it takes. How do they do it if they're not able to give Ukraine that NATO blueprint? How are they able to prove to Vladimir Putin that it's not a bluff, that they actually are, it's not just intentions, that they're going to give the money and the aid? So what we have it is essentially it's boiling down to these sort of DIY, do-it-yourself alliance building meetings. This is one of them tonight. We saw one last month between Zelensky and Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister. Last January 2012, they signed one of these agreements. This morning in Berlin, we had Zelensky and the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz signing one of these agreements, patchwork agreements, and now France stepping up to the plate. It is imperative, perhaps more than ever, to do these types of exercises. You can do the eye rolling. You could say, oh, it still amounts to nothing. It could never match Putin's manpower and guns on the battlefield. Ukraine still will not be able to muster without the U.S. But the reason it's imperative is precisely because of that. On the one hand, you have the U.S., these forces of America First isolationism, pulling the U.S. away from that Ukraine orbit, away from helping Ukraine, leaving Europe to have to fend for itself in helping Ukraine. And on the other hand, you have in Russia a Putin who is in finer fettle, it seems, than ever, in very confident posture. It seems he knows that time is now on his side. It seems he sees the generosity of Ukraine's allies waning or having a date of expiration on it. And it seems that he thinks it is just a matter of time before he is able to perhaps overcome or overtake Ukraine and get a deal on his terms. That's why deals like this even though they can induce some eye rolling and say, well, what's the real difference here? 3 billion extra euros for a country that is overwhelmed by Russia right now. What's the difference? It is symbolic, and at the same time, it is about message sending. And when you're talking about global geopolitics, it's not for nothing, these types of exercises. It does send a message, as we heard Antonia say, that broadside by Macron against Vladimir Putin as an interfering, revisionist, destabilizing, election-interfering president. This is all very important. It shows Putin that, yeah, Europe is still there. Europe's members are still there with Ukraine. They're not giving up anytime soon.
All right, Douglas Herbert, our international affairs commentator, thank you very much for now. We'll be looking at this story in more detail throughout the evening. Do stay with us here on France 24. We have got more news coming up for you in about 17 minutes.